Well, it's great to be here in Texas and good to be with all of you at a very important point in our national history. You know, since we met in St. Louis last year, our national security has declined. At the same time, we have a president who seems determined to find some way or another to restrict our Second Amendment rights. He doesn't have adequate time to protect American interests and American citizens around the world. And I think these two phenomena are very closely related. Because I think the president has a very different view of what security and freedom mean than we do. And let's just consider the difficulties that we faced and how they tie in to the arms trade treaty recently approved by the United Nations and signed by this administration. We've seen in very tragic terms that the war on terrorism is far from over. First, in Benghazi on September the 11th of last year, where American Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 of his brave colleagues were gunned down by terrorists affiliated with al-Qaeda. Were not given adequate protection before, during, or sadly in the immediate aftermath of the attack. What did the president do about this? 5 days before the attack, he said, in accepting his party's renomination for president, al-Qaeda is on the road to defeat. And 5 days later, his personal representative in Libya and 3 others were killed by the people who were on the road to defeat. He couldn't find the time to look into the cause of the killings. He had a story about a Mohammed video that outraged some demonstrators, even as his own intelligence services, as we've learned in the past few days, had pictures of representatives of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula participating in the attack on the consulate in Benghazi. Just this week, in response to pressure to find out how these undefended or inadequately defended Americans were left in jeopardy, the White House press spokesman, Jay Carney, said, "That's a long time ago." Well, 8 months. It was 8 months ago, and I suppose that is a long time ago if you have the attention span of a fruit fly. The second, September the 11th, was a tragedy. We're not going to leave it alone. We are going to find out the facts because Americans all around the world are in jeopardy. And tragically, we saw this on April the 15th at the finish line of the Boston Marathon, where terrorists undoubtedly connected with and aided by, perhaps instructed by, international terrorist organizations struck at this icon of American life. And what was the White House reaction? David Axelrod, the president's chief political strategist, said in a television interview, "Well, I'm sure," these are his words, "I'm sure what was going through the president's mind is, well, we really don't know who did this. It was tax day," implying that it was an anti-tax protest, you know, from those Tea Party people. That was their first thought, that it was an American who did it, that it was an American who did it, not that the global war on terrorism tragically had struck in America again. And just in the past few days, we've learned that these terrorists hadn't originally planned for tax day, Mr. President. They were aiming for the 4th of July. That says everything you need to know about the motivations of these terrorists. And what it showed, I think, as the city of Boston and its suburbs were locked down as our law enforcement agencies searched for the terrorists, there were more people in the Boston area wishing they had a gun than in any other time in recent history. Obama cannot admit that the global war on terrorism continues, but he continues to fight against the right of Americans guaranteed by the Second Amendment to defend themselves against this terrorism by having firearms lawfully obtained that they can use to protect themselves and their families. And as a number of people have already said, the NRA has done a fantastic job to stop the recent efforts at grabbing American citizens' guns. But they're not over yet, and this is where the Arms Trade Treaty comes into play. It's true that a majority of senators have said that they wouldn't ratify it, but the fight there hasn't begun. And as the president's, as the administration's domestic efforts at restricting Second Amendment rights fail, as they certainly appear to be, this is where I think the backup plan comes into play. After 15 years of negotiation, they finally got the Arms Trade Treaty that they wanted, and it was just what we feared. We stood against this during 8 years in the Bush administration. One of my happiest moments serving in the State Department was to go to New York in 2001 and say we would oppose any arms trade treaty that violated the Second Amendment. It was almost unprecedented. American diplomats don't talk about the Constitution. Is that something they should be concerned about? Absolutely. And this treaty is a threat to the Constitution. Now, the Obama administration will say, oh, but it doesn't affect domestic gun control regulations. This is absolutely not true, as the text of the agreement itself makes clear. There's no guarantee for individual rights in the Arms Trade Treaty. In fact, the language that Obama points to simply says that the treaty's signatories are mindful, listen to that word, they are mindful of the legitimate trade and lawful ownership of arms for recreational, cultural, historical, and sporting activities. No mention of self-defense. No mention of self-defense. And here's another little interesting fact about international treaty law. This mindfulness that they point to is in the preamble, which has no binding effect. The binding effect of treaties are in the operative paragraphs, and in the operative paragraphs, Article 5 requires nations, listen to this, to establish and maintain a national control system, including a national control list. What does that sound like to you? They know exactly what they're doing. Article 10 requires signatories to regulate brokering of conventional arms, and it goes on and on and on. And here's what's going to happen. Although a lot of good work, as I say, has been done to get senators to oppose this, the administration will say, no, 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 it's not about domestic gun control. And they will try and find a way to get it ratified. And then, once it's ratified, we will suddenly find out that actually it is about domestic gun control. And the provisions that I read to you and many others require us, because we're a party to the treaty, to enact exactly the kinds of gun control legislation that the NRA has just defeated in the Senate. So it's important, and this audience is knowledgeable about it, but it's important for our fellow citizens not to be deceived by the kind of propaganda campaign that the Obama administration and others will wage. And it's true that gun control is on the cutting edge here, but this is part of a pattern by the administration to try and find ways through international treaties to avoid its inability politically to get what it wants through Congress, and to avoid constitutional restraints by trying to do it indirectly through the treaty process. This is a radical diversion from our tradition. It reflects an unwillingness to acknowledge the importance of American sovereignty. In fact, the president's constantly talking about pooling or sharing sovereignty in the environmental area, in the area of the death penalty and family law, in things like what they now call the defamation of religion, to try and find a way around the First Amendment to restrict our freedom of speech, as they're trying to do through the Arms Trade Treaty, restricting our Second Amendment freedoms. This is part of a package. It is part of an approach by those who don't like the Constitution, who don't like the American system of sovereignty, who don't like the direct democracy that's reflected in effective organizations like the NRA. And it represents something the president has tried to do in his foreign policy as well, and that's cede the initiative and the direction of American policy away from our hands and into the hands of international treaty bodies. Fortunately, the Constitution requires that 2/3 of the Senate agree to this. I think we can block it if we're aware of it. We then have to worry about the President using executive orders during the next 4 years. Having signed the treaty, he'll say, well, we can't do anything to defeat its purpose, and therefore I must do the following. This issue is far from over, domestically or through treaties. It's critical that we stand up and defend our freedoms against the fear of international terrorism. It's critical that we stand up for our Constitution and our sovereignty against overbearing international treaties. And let's be clear, if the administration in Washington won't protect us, the American people will protect ourselves. Thank you very much.